In a talk at GDC, founder of Inkle John Ingold described 3 levels of freedom in video games defined by the questions that those games will make a player ask themselves. In a game with no freedom, he says, a player will ask themselves, what am I supposed to do? In a game with some freedom, a player will ask, what can I do? But in a game that truly gives a player freedom, the question they should eventually end up asking themselves is, yikes, what have I done? The game Ingold was talking about when he made this analysis was Inkle's upcoming open-world archaeology/detective game, Heaven's Vault. Inkle specialise in interactive fiction, and previously released titles such as the award-winning 80 Days, a reimagining of Jules Verne's work of a similar name. Heaven's Vault is the studio's most ambitious project to date, a 3D open-world narrative mystery, and the best point-and-click adventure I have ever played. In Heaven's Vault, you play as Alia El Azra, a skeptical archaeologist from the University at Iox, who reluctantly agrees to investigate, with help from a robotic companion called Six, the disappearance of roboticist Yaniki Renba. This begins a fascinating adventure that sends you from moon to moon across the Nebula, talking to the inhabitants, uncovering mysteries of the world, and finding lost relics to help translate the fictional language of Ancient. A fascinating mechanic in itself, but a topic for another time. Instead, what I want to talk about here is how Heaven's Vault gives its players freedom. In many open-world games, players can be given a lot of freedom because the fun is found in the systems. No matter where a player goes, there is loot to find and enemies to kill, and the player can return to a more linear main story afterwards. But Heaven's Vault is a narrative game. It's all about telling a story, and it's all pre-written. So how does Heaven's Vault allow the player to go where they want and make their own decisions, while still progressing a story that is interesting and engaging narratively? How does Heaven's Vault tell a great story with freedom? In terms of player freedom, we can think about the questions from the start of the video. In order for a player to ask, what can I do? They need to have choices, and for a player to potentially think, yikes, what have I done? Those choices need to have an impact. So firstly, the player needs to always be in control. The game can't be a linear story with the occasional branching option. The player should always be making the decision of what to do next. And decisions in Heaven's Vault must always affect the game state, even in the simplest of ways. If you're given options in a conversation, they can't all funnel back into the same outcome like it's Fallout 4, because if they do, then your decisions in that conversation haven't affected the game. And similarly, if you do have a conversation with a character, then attempt to speak to them again, they can't simply have the same dialogue options as before, because if they do, then did your previous conversation even happen? Time should feel like it's always moving forward. If you choose to shout at a slave trader, then maybe you won't be able to bargain with them later to find the name of an injured worker. There should be opportunity costs and the potential for missed events, because if you can always go back and change a decision, then that first decision didn't affect the game state. At every turn, the player makes decisions about how to progress, and those decisions are important and permanent to keep the player in control and to keep the game moving forward. But if decisions are permanent and you can close off certain options through other actions, is there a risk of closing yourself off entirely and breaking the game? This was an issue in some older adventure games. For example, in the text-based Hitchhiker's Guide to the Galaxy, the minor decision not to feed a stray dog a cheese sandwich can inexplicably and unfairly lead to an unwinnable fail state later on. Heaven's Vault avoids this by never having a single puzzle or problem that sits between the player and progress. Because if that happens, the player will hit that one problem and fall into the position of asking, what am I supposed to do? Heaven's Vault is designed as a series of locations or episodes in an open world map that the player discovers by finding clues. The order that you can travel to these locations isn't fixed, and one that you find 30% into the game, another player might find 60% in, and another player might never find at all. The clues could be items that you pick up or information given to you in conversations, but importantly, there will always be more possible clues than a player could need. You could talk to a farmer and hear about a suspicious character who matches the description of someone you're looking for. But if you don't find that farmer or don't try to speak to them, maybe you find an item on the floor that the suspicious character dropped when they were here. This is similar to the silent repetition used in A Short Hike, where multiple shovels are scattered across the island to increase the chance of a player picking one up, which then despawns all the others. By always having multiple clues that can lead you to new places, there is no one correct way to go forward in Heaven's Vault, and players have the freedom to follow their own hunches and carve out their own story, while still being able to find vital clues. This gives the player more freedom while making sure they don't get stuck and can always move forward. But Heaven's Vault also limits the extent to which a player can go backwards or go nowhere. A classic problem in adventure games is when a player chooses to return to an area to search for extra clues or items that simply don't exist, grinding their story to a halt. In Heaven's Vault, you arrive in new locations when you find clues to lead you there. These locations will allow you to discover new clues to lead you to new places, but once you leave with enough clues to follow, you won't be able to return. Sometimes, in order for Heaven's Vault to tell a great story with high player freedom, it has to limit its players' freedom to tell a bad story. So, a good part of the reason that Heaven's Vault is able to tell an interesting and dynamic story is how the game is designed to feel like time is always moving forward, structured to maintain the pacing of the story by not letting players go backwards or in circles, and having the players' decisions affect the game state and provide direction for the story they find. But, in order for the player to make real decisions and guide the narrative, Heaven's Vault has to have the content to allow it. If a player has to choose between showing an important discovery to their boss or to their friend, the game needs to have stories and dialogue that can develop in both of those directions. But it also has to handle the situation if a player does neither. As a player has more freedom and more options for where to go, what to say, what to do, and when to do it, the number of possible combinations explodes, and every situation has to be written. Inkle needed a method that allowed them to write large amounts of content. When most people think of non-linear stories, they will think of dialogue trees, where conversations branch off depending on a player's choices, but Heaven's Vault takes a different approach. Rather than connecting everything together in a tree, content in Heaven's Vault isn't connected at all. Content in Heaven's Vault is atomic. Everything in the game exists as an individual block of content sitting somewhere within the code, gated by tags and preconditions, and when those preconditions are met, the game can reach for that content and present it to the player. These tags can be related to what location you're in, what objects are nearby, what items you have, or what information you know. And these atoms could contain actions, single lines of text, or even mini dialogue trees. For example, before levering open a chest with a fire poker, Heaven's Vault will check that you have the poker and that you're close enough to the chest, but also that you know the chest is locked, because if you didn't know that, why wouldn't you try to open it normally? But if those conditions are met, you will be given the option to force it open. The main advantage of using atomic content is that it creates a story which is inherently non-linear. Instead of a specific story that the player follows, the game is built from discrete reorderable chunks that the player brings into the game through their own choices, and in the same stroke this creates a game with high player freedom. Every action that the player takes, whether interacting with an object or speaking a line of dialogue, determines what future options will be available, creating a story that is unique to the specific player. The potential downside, of course, is that the writers no longer have control. A machine is checking tags and presenting content to the player, but it doesn't understand storytelling. If you pick up a cup with an ancient seal on it, you could either talk about the seal or about an old friend who loves tea. Both are triggered by holding a mug, but only one is relevant. Inkle's solution to this is simple, elegant, and allowed the game to have a great range of conversations. All atoms in the game were sorted into 4 scopes: moments, rooms, episodes, and the entire game, and options are prioritised in that order. If you need to respond to dialogue, that's a moment. If you can open a door or pull a lever, that's in a room. If you're thinking about your findings, that's in an episode, and anything more general goes in the game-wide scope. Moments, rooms, episodes, game. This system allows the atomic content to flow naturally into your game no matter what, because this order of priority matches what the player will want to do, allowing the game the non-linearity of the atomic content while still giving players the most relevant options first. These scopes also have a second advantage. The inclusion of the fourth game-wide scope that can hold general conversations about the characters and the world is really powerful for a narrative game. Not only does it let the game fill dead air when a player is travelling or hasn't found anything to interact with, but it also gives the characters room to develop. One of my favourite lines I saw in Heaven's Vault came from Six, the robot. Alia named them Six because they were the sixth robot she was given by the university after losing or breaking the first 5. And in a moment of peace, Six piped up and asked, "What did you call your first robot?" That is such a brilliantly human line of dialogue. Obviously she couldn't have called the first robot 1 unless she knew there would be more. It came out of nowhere and gave Six sentience, asking a question completely independent of my goals as a player. But of course, while the systems and their implementation allow this moment to arise, it wouldn't have existed without someone writing it in the first place. And that is the other major advantage of the way the game is constructed. How does Heaven's Vault tell a great story with freedom? Because it allows its writers to write. With the atomic structure, new conversations and dialogue don't have to be painstakingly inserted into pre-existing trees, and there isn't the issue of new content potentially breaking the logic of a previous section. Instead, the writers could come up with new stories, new options, new ideas for world building or character building, and all they would need to do is add relevant tags, which is trivial because tags are simple additive logic and are included in the text. The writers could even give Alia and Six expressions and body language by adding small triggers to the end of dialogue. And that ability for the writing staff to do a lot of work independently of the artists and developers gives them the freedom to write quality content at scale. In an interview with Rock Paper Shotgun, John Inkle talked about how when Heaven's Vault was just about to release, he was having to convince himself not to keep adding more dialogue because the atomic structure of the game still allowed him to do that. So let's recap. How does Heaven's Vault tell a great story with freedom? By letting its players make decisions with a real impact on the game state, and by giving the sense that time is always moving forward. By giving its players multiple avenues to find clues and advance the story wherever they go. By making it difficult for the player to get stuck and keeping the game moving forward. By using an atomic structure to create a story that is inherently non-linear and player-driven. And finally, by giving writers the space to write good stories. Heaven's Vault is my favourite adventure game. It's an adventure game that manages to tell a rich and detailed story while allowing the player to choose their own path, and it's one that doesn't get bogged down by choke points as the player gets stuck on one specific puzzle. The term game feel is normally used to describe the quality of gameplay when taken out of context. How fun is it to just move a character around and use the mechanics? But I don't know if there's a similar term to describe the fluidity of decision making in Heaven's Vault. Decisions are so frequent, effortless and natural that it often doesn't feel like there was a decision that you needed to make. You just went where you thought you should, did what you thought you should, and no matter what that is, the game just goes along with you. In a game where all the content is pre-written, you still feel like you have complete freedom. And I think the biggest compliment I can give Heaven's Vault is that this is a 15 to 20 hour long adventure game where not once did I have to ask myself, what am I supposed to do? Hey, thanks for watching. I hope you found this video interesting and enjoyed hearing about Heaven's Vault. I tried to avoid spoiling too much of the game because this is one that I really enjoyed and I would highly recommend it to fans of adventure games or interactive fiction. This video was originally supposed to cover multiple topics, but I decided to split it up, and so there will be another video on Heaven's Vault soon that's basically already written, looking at the game's thematic puzzles. If you want to watch that video, subscribe to the channel if you're not, leave a like, leave a comment, all that sort of thing, and hopefully I'll see you in the next one. Goodbye.